Welcome back to part two of our conversation with Mr. Nitin Gokhale. In the part one, we have heard him talk about his experiences in the Northeast, his experiences of becoming a journalist. And in part two, we will, of course, ask him the easy questions in the end, but also query him on what's happening in Bangladesh, how and why do you think government has not responded to events that are happening in Jammu. So let's go. So take you back to Bangladesh. You have researched RNAW operations in Bangladesh, and we know what has happened very recently. How do you think this is going to play forward?
So Bangladesh was always very vulnerable to anti. I mean, vulnerable means our side. I mean, our flank on the east was always vulnerable to anti-India activities, despite the fact that majority of the time, thanks to Sheikh Hasina, we've had in the last 15 years a very good run in Bangladesh. But there have always been elements within Bangladesh who were pro-Pakistan, who always felt that this separation from Pakistan was a mistake and we shouldn't, be aligned with India because it's a enemy country. That population, in my estimation, was about 35 to 40%.
Which is huge.
Huge. So we always knew this. I mean, Indian establishment always knew this. As a journalist, as a researcher, somebody, I first went to Dhaka from Guwahati in 1986 when General Irshad was in power and he was doing a sham of an election in May 1986. So my interactions and my, I won't call it experience, but my interactions and my knowledge, a little bit of ground knowledge about Bangladesh goes back to 1986. And I always felt that India was never a welcome country really. It was always transactional. Sheikh Hasina chose for historical reasons to put all her eggs in one basket, and we benefited from it. They benefited from it, and the army benefited from it. But if you see, she had started subtly allowing their military to buy Chinese hardware in large quantity, because that was one way of keeping the military happy, because the Chinese could give what the military wanted there,
Correct. At a
on the
lesser
side.
cost.
Yeah, exactly. At the exchequer's cost, but she ignored that. But on the strategic front, on the development front, she wanted India. So electricity projects, developmental projects, all that. And she helped India. Let's not forget, in 2011-12, all these insurgent groups and their leaders in the northeast, their operations were wound up in Bangladesh, thanks to her
Correct.
and her clarity. So, going forward, since you asked me that, very difficult to predict, but we have had some discussions on camera with experts, and some of us have concluded that it's best for India to let things settle down there, if at all, and be aware that it's a flank which is now vulnerable, more vulnerable than before, eastern flank, and take adequate measures to counter it or prevent any untoward incident from that side. There will always be players there. The US is there. There are Europeans. There is China. There are other Islamic countries which would want that to become a tinderbox. In fact, senior journalist Hiranyamai Kalekar in 2010 or 11 had written a book, Bangladesh, the next Afghanistan. If
Wow.
you, yeah. So as way back as then he had written this book, he was roundly criticized for what it was not, and still not, in a sense. But who knows? Maybe that prophecy will come
Come
true
true now.
now. So that is what my take is. I am yet to firm up my prognosis about what will happen next, because it's just less than a month.
Less than a month.
Less than a month. So
From Bangladesh, sir, from your RNAW, let us move to another of your great books on the Elam War 4. This was Sri Lanka.
that's right.
And this is one rare incidence in world military history where you have actually wiped out the complete insurgency. And for good, because it's more than 10 years now and
More than 15 years.
more than 15 years and it's holding.
Right.
So, what is the experience there and what did the Sri Lankan military do right over there? And the second part of question would be why can't we do it?
Okay, we'll answer the second question as in that sequence itself. Well, you have to look at a bit of background as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. They had three editions of the Elam War before the final war. In between, India's IPKF operations also took place, and none of them succeeded because of lack of political clarity or political objective or political will, if you have to put it on the other way. And in that period, between 2006 and 2009, when Elam War 4 took place, Sri Lanka was lucky to have a president who was determined to wipe out the LTT, the Tamil Tigers. His brother, a former military officer, a colonel in the army, retired colonel who had
Gotabaya.
left Gotabaya. So Mahinda Rajapaksa was the president, Gotabaya was the defense secretary. And a military army commander who was also determined, who had, and some of the senior leadership, major generals and brigadiers.
Fonseca.
Sharath Fonseca was the army commander, and then there was Shavendra Silva, who was the current CDS, who was a 5-8 division GOC there that time. Kamal Gunaratne, who was the current defense secretary, was also leading 59 division that time. So they had all had become, they had been sort of, had come out of that experience of the 3 wars previously and had got bruised and battered and yet come out strong from there. So they were experienced leadership that time. And the revulsion against terrorism as practiced by LTT and others was at its peak in that decade after 9/11 and all that. So all circumstances conspired to give Sri Lankan state the upper hand. By that time, but more than, I mean, apart from the political clarity, the political will, clear decision making, and seeing it through because of the political leadership, the military leadership was one aspect. Second was, like I said, the global opinion was against terrorism, pure terrorism like practiced by Tamil Tigers. Third was that the LTT itself, the Tamil Tigers themselves, had become very unwieldy as a military force. Their strength used to be guerrilla tactics, unconventional, nimble-footed, quick reactions, all that. So by 2005-06, because there was a ceasefire in between and all that, for whatever reasons, it had become a lumbering elephant rather than a sprouting, a springing tiger.
Yeah.
So they had tried to become a conventional army. They wanted to hold ground. They had a line, and they sort of deployed people. I'm talking about military terms because one learned all this.
Absolutely.
And instead of remaining a guerrilla force, they tried to become a conventional army. And the Sri Lankan army, on the other hand, became a guerrilla force in its practice and its execution. So Sharath Fonseca created 8-man teams. They would go behind the enemy lines, do sabotage, destroy supply lines, destroy their infrastructure, all that. And through that monsoon, through the swamps and other
extremely hostile territory.
Very hostile territory, they would do all this because they had agile teams. So he actually turned this entire thing on its head, Sharath Fonseca. The Navy, the Sri Lankan Navy is not appreciated enough of that time, the leadership, for doing what they did. And the intelligence services and the cooperation between different intelligence services, including India, which didn't want to be seen as aiding and abetting Sri Lanka's war. So it all worked again very well. Sri Lankan Navy, after studying their previous failures, realized that big ships won't work. So they created small ships, speedboats, and they created ship swarms to take on the LTT suicide bombers.
Wow.
So hundreds of boats were created, manufactured, and they used to do the operations like like what we call about the UAV swarms or the drone swarms. They used ship swarms, small boat swarms, like that. And the intelligence agencies worked. So the Sri Lankan Navy went after the armory. So the LTT was very innovative. It used to keep its arms and ammunition on floating ships or barges on high seas. And whenever required, they used to
send a small
ship and get it into northern areas or the eastern areas. The Sri Lankan Navy created a blockade which couldn't get through their ammunition or this thing, and went and destroyed proactively these barges and these ammunition dumps on high seas. One operation was done almost close to the Australian western coast.
That far?
That far, in the Indian Ocean. First they cleared the east in 2006-07, and then started moving the line beyond Anuradhapura into northern areas of Sri Lanka, Jaffna and
Which was their
beyond, which was their
heartland,
heartland.
LTTE heartland.
And then they started squeezing the LTTE in smaller,
Areas.
enclaves. So Mulai Tebu, Kilinochi, and finally the operation happened on 18th, 19th May 2009, where the top LTTE leadership was eliminated, including
Prabhakaran.
Velupillai Prabhakaran, his son Anthony, and Susai, who was his intelligence chief. All of these people were eliminated in those 2-3 days. So it was a clear-cut operation, a clear-cut objective, clear instructions that you have to destroy them. You have to completely eliminate them.
No
No ifs and
prisoners.
buts. No ifs and buts there. No negotiations. So they have been accused of human rights violations. They have been accused of being harsh on collateral damage to civilian population. But the civilian population, I have maintained this and I have been criticized for it, that it was taken hostage by the LTT as shield, the Tamil population. They were hapless and helpless people. But again, it will happen in war. I'm not judging how many and how many people were killed, but that is a fact that people were killed. But if you're shelling and if you're fighting a conflict which is raging with such intensity, there will be collateral damage. Second question you asked, why can't we do it? We are too vast a country, too open a society, and also we are squeamish in many ways. It's not a criticism, but
We do not want to take hard
we
decisions.
do not want to take hard decisions, or we do not want to. Because we are a larger country, our standing also gets affected if we do blatant, human rights violations or do
We disregard
operations.
the
Disregard the
conventions.
conventionals which are there. So it's a too big a risk to take in doing all that. But still, some of the elements of success of that operation, Gilam War 4 of the Sri Lankan military, and again, like 1971, here everybody worked together. They had a MCNS, Military Media Center for National Security, which was a one-point contact point for all of us journalists. We used to get our passes. They created a bubble in the north and the east where you couldn't penetrate the bubble without their permission or without their will. And they shut out all the contrary opinions and contrary viewpoints from the Tamil side, from the LTTE
So you
side.
starve the
Starve
terrorist of
the oxygen of
glamour.
publicity and also carry out your operations. It was a classic success story. And in my book, I have a full chapter on the MCNS. We could, as a journalist, I won't be happy if you do that. But if you want to succeed in eliminating insurgencies and creating control, you cannot be half-hearted. That's my point. The bottom line is you have to be wholehearted into it.
You have almost given out the recipes, but I don't know if there are people enough, or I would say man enough to take it and cook a goose. So you mentioned a shift of focus of Indian military towards northern borders. And there is something very interesting that happened just 2 days back. A terrorist designated by India who was responsible for a jailbreak in Punjab was extradited from China or Hong Kong. Now, this is a complete contrast to what has happened with so-called Khalistani referendum and Khalistani supporters who are in US or Canada. And US, despite professing great, not familiarity, but great love towards India, everything coming together to dance of democracies, they have not done anything like that. Whereas this guy has been extradited by China. Also, about 3-4 weeks back, we had the Chinese ambassador write in one of our papers, one of our leading dailies, almost professing that ties be reset and doing something more constructive together. How do you think this is panning out? Because is China actually trying to reach out and say that let's get back to business? And also, do you think it is in India's interest to now, after the Galwan incident, where after almost 30 years we lost a life, to again restart or recalibrate or re-engage China on a different term?
I think the time has come to rethink our strategy on China. This 4 years, there has been this strategy that no normalcy on border, no talks or no engagement.
Which works well with Pakistan.
It works well. Again, people will debate that also, but I agree with you. At least till now, it has worked. For last 7-8 years, that it has worked very well. With China, we have a much more complicated equation than with Pakistan, because the imports from China are the highest. We are many of our sectors, electronic goods, otherwise even drugs, pharmaceuticals, they're all dependent on China, heavily dependent. I won't say all dependent on China, but heavily dependent. And of course, it is also true that the government cannot be seen as compromising on India's sovereignty, India's asks on the line of actual control, all that. But somewhere, many people who are far more knowledgeable than me on China have said this, including my friend Vijay Gokhale, former foreign secretary, China specialist, has studied China for 30, 35 years, having been ambassador, foreign secretary, also director
Right.
of the China desk. He has also suggested in a interaction with me that it's time for a political dialogue to begin, a political contact to begin, not dialogue, political contact to begin. So far, it is only the military which is talking on the boundary or the border. It can never take any decisions which will have far-reaching impact. We'll have to look at the China-India equation or the relationship in a much larger context, larger framework. And I think India has gone beyond a point where that strategy, has crossed the line where that strategy no longer gives you those kind of returns.
It's probably outlived itself.
Outlived, it's a strategy of diminishing returns. So we need to re-engage. Re-engagement does not mean, like everybody else has been saying, and I have also maintained, that we are giving up on our claims or our asks or our demands on the LAC. But at least begin talks. And other ministries, apart from the Ministry of External Affairs, are now clamoring for special visas to Chinese technicians,
Correct.
Chinese specialists, PLI schemes to be given
Given
out
to
to
Chinese companies.
And if you don't allow them entry into strategic sectors, and there is a committee of secretaries now which looks at every, that press note number 3 in 2020, which said that any investment or any input coming from countries which have land borders with India, which essentially means
Basically
China,
China.
essentially means China, will be scrutinized. Every investment, every proposal will be scrutinized, and they're doing that. So if you're doing that already, and if you are also being very careful about not allowing them into strategic sectors like telecom, electricity, other strategic sectors, then why not go forward, because there are no other alternate supply chains available. What intrigues me that so far we haven't responded. So to respond to your specific question about the Chinese ambassador, he is overeager. Why not seize that chance in a different way? Start with two ambassadors speaking to each other.
Correct.
India's ambassador to Beijing and Chinese ambassador in Delhi starting to speak at least.
Maybe write a joint
Maybe
editorial. somewhere.
editorial, or have just discussions on that, because low level officials will not be able to get us far. And the reality is that we are, because of Tibet's annexation, China and India are now neighbors. They're land boundary. No other country of the Quad members, for instance, has a disputed land boundary with China. So we have to have our own approach, and which the government has been saying for a long time. But we haven't executed that. So I think that's something that I'm very interested about, how this will go about. And it's a very good question that you asked.
Thank you so much. And unlike Pakistan, even them we cannot ignore too much, but China nobody can ignore. It is too large, too powerful, too important.
Even the US doesn't ignore.
Even US doesn't.
I mean, US keeps talking about de-risking, decoupling, all that, but it's a whole range of top echelons of the US administration have made a beeline to China in recent 12 months. From Secretary of State to Secretary of Defense to Commerce Secretary, everybody has been there.
So why not us?
Yeah.
Before we get into the short answer types, a question about your profession. Journalism is and was known as the fourth pillar. But in today's day and age, there is a question mark on that. Is it really a strong pillar which keeps the roof up along with the other three? Or has it become how do I put it? Has it become a institutionalized journalism?
Well, classical journalism, as you would have grown up on and I would have practiced, fortunately, is dead.
Oh, good you say that, because then we can bury it and move on from it.
Yeah, but and why this happened? You must. One has to understand. That's my conclusion. I may be completely wrong, and people may not agree with it. But the fact is, today journalism, or I would call it more of information sharing, is calculated in terms of hashtags, algorithms, keywords, tweets,
Views.
feedback, views, that kind of thing, which we were lucky not to get bothered about or concentrated about. Yes, we were bothered about our circulation of newspapers or ratings of TV shows and TV channels. But nobody said that you have to do this. This keyword has to be inserted in the first paragraph that you're writing, because that
The
will
algorithm
will catch up. All that is not happening, and that's the unfortunate part. But that's the tech revolution that has brought, and the attention spans of your consumers are now divided in multiple
Correct.
silos. So you have to do that. I'm not sitting on judgment on that reality, but that is a fact, and therefore your ability to convey or write longer pieces, or have the opportunity to write longer pieces no longer exists, except for some few publications here and there. Everyone, including the biggest of publications the world over, are compromising on this, and they are sort of dictated by what we call
Market forces.
market forces, and what we used to call marketing arms, which has happened in Indian context also. The other issue I have is that not issue, but a good thing that has happened is journalists are no longer the privileged, spoilt practitioners of the profession. Earlier, we used to pride, or we used to even have bloated egos that only we have the information and we will convey it to the general public. Today, information has got democratized because of the availability of different platforms. Sometimes there are far better informed specialists on certain subjects than journalists themselves, because journalists, after all, are generalists.
Correct.
They sort of their ability is to convey it in short, concise interpretation for the readers or viewers. But today there are enough people who can start their own YouTube channel. They can have their Twitter threads. They can have their long Substack newsletters going to their subscribers. All that. So it's no longer that privilege that journalists used to enjoy of being the mediators between common people, readers and viewers, and the authorities or
The news creators.
the news creators, like that. That is the change that has come. And I call my own journey in journalism now 41 years from telegram to telegram. I started sending news from the field on the old Morse code telegram. Today I have an app which can send news to the world in 30 seconds.
One has got obsolete and the other guy is in jail now.
Absolutely. He just got arrested in France, I
In
think.
France. And we'll segue into some short answers
Sure,
and
sure.
more easy talk.
Yeah, of course.
Let's start with your career. What do you think is one happiest moment that you remember from 81, 82 till date?
Well, from 83 to now, so 41 years. Happiest moment was to start as a head of the team, launch a newspaper from scratch. Second newspaper that I worked for, called the Northeast Times. I was all of 28. I was leading a team of 43 people.
Wow.
And we made an immediate impact. So Assam's former Chief Minister, Prafulla Kumar Mahanta, who later became a friend, never forgives me or never forgets to mention that you are the one responsible for, partly responsible for fall of my government, the dismissal of my government in 1990. Because we had done a report which created, the doubts in the central government's mind, Chandrasekhar government in center. So we were, like I said, we were a bunch of youngsters, eager, inexperienced, but full of passion. So that was the
Happiest moment.
moment.
Any regrets, sir? Other than fighter pilot dreams.
Well, that is also not a regret. Actually, if you ask me, no regret really, because I will live the life the same way if I am offered this chance again, because this has given me everything. So no regret.
It's an amazing answer, sir, and very military kind of an answer that most of the military people who have been on the show, Army, Navy, Air Force, I think almost all of them have said that I would do it again.
Yes.
Just the way I've done.
Absolutely.
So there's one question we ask all our guests, whether they are from the military or not. Please rate Indian Army, Navy, Air Force on a scale of 10. It is a light answer. It is a light question, but sometimes it gets serious in the trolls that will come.
I know that will happen. Well, I have had I'll say Air Force, Navy, Army, but I must also explain why. I have had the longest association
So
with
Air
the
Force
Army.
is 10, sir?
No, not 10. I mean, I'm saying in terms of being technology dependent, I would say aware, like that. I mean, that is the thing, if you ask me, keeping up with the modern trends. I'm giving it in that context: Air Force, Navy, and Army.
Army.
But I have had the longest association and longest friendships and longest, benefit. I must put this on record that I've benefited from the Army the most than the other two services. So can't really. My father was in the Army. That apart, the childhood that we had was so interesting and so varied that those experiences have stood us in good stead. But yes, I mean, if you ask me, today's thing, this is the
Air Force, Navy, and Army.
That's right.
I hope some army officer is listening to that and he comes and counters you here, because if nothing else, it will make a good reel.
Sure.
So you wanted to be a fighter pilot and you landed up being a journalist, and you have really done a great job of it. But if not a fighter pilot and if not a journalist,
Film critic.
film critic, that is very interesting.
My third passion, if you want to call it that, or the second passion. So sports, films. I'm a avid listener and a collector of trivia on Hindi films, Hindi film music. I still get excited about
So you
some
must
new
share-
discovery.
You must share something which I wouldn't know for sure, but you think that most of the audience would not know. About something to do with Bollywood or...
Well, offhand I can't remember, but I must tell you this. My first interview in my life as a journalist was with Asha Parekh.
Wow.
I have interviewed Kishore Kumar, I have interviewed Farooq Sheikh, like that. But, a lot of trivia gets collected in my mind. So, just to tell you that I did not know, for instance, that Madan Mohan was in the army, the music composer, the composer of ghazals,
Right.
the Badshah of ghazals. He served in the Indian Army for 2 years in the World War II, and then came into the film industry. And he was a son of Rai Bahadur Chunilal, who was a rich businessman in then undivided India, in Pakistan. So many such stories.
Even I didn't know. So it's all-
So there you are.
very varied passions, I must say.
That's
And it's great that you chose this profession, because knowing you would have done well anywhere. Like you mentioned, you spend a lot of time with the military, mostly army, some air force, some navy.
Yes.
Any one memorable incident you remember which has stuck to you for time, that this was probably the most beautiful or the most perfect way that a military could represent itself?
Oh, I think almost all experiences, I must say, barring one or two exceptions, have been something that I cherish with the military, especially with the army. I always say this to the civilians, that this is just only profession I know, soldiering, and I mean all three in that sense, but mostly army, is where people go beyond the call of their duty. They put their lives on the line. And this is across the board. Wherever I've gone, I've lived in the remotest of places. So, just to give you an example, I got, for various reasons, we got stranded in a place called Noklak in eastern Nagaland, in Tuensang district. And there was no place to stay, there was no transport to come back to Tuensang or Mokokchung. And what do we do? The civilians were not very cooperative, the administrative officers were block development officers and all that. So somebody said, there is an Assam Rifles post here, why don't you try your luck there? And as luck would have it, we walked across, me and my colleague from another publication, and just went into the post there, led by a young major, company commander. And he said, we are here, we have stranded, and you are the only hope that we have of getting shelter. It's raining heavily, monsoon, and heavy monsoon in the northeast. So without hesitation, without think, for the next 2 days, they hosted us and regaled us with the stories of the Nagas and the Burmese coming from across the border. We had gone actually to do a story on the Burmese refugees coming into Nagaland, because there was some salt shortage in the western part of Myanmar. I'm talking about 1992.
Right.
So such touching stories, and I have actually written in my blog I think about a decade ago, what the forge and my parents taught me.
I've read that, sir.
And I said, I owe everything to the forge in that sense. My upbringing, my habits, my outlook to life, take life as it comes is my motto. Has been. It's on my computer screen.
Wow.
So it's all derived from experiences in the childhood, experiences working with the Forge, reporting on them, living with them, walking with them. So another memorable experience again in Nagaland to go on a live ambush with a unit. I think it was 25 Punjab, and that CO took the risk and said, "Okay, you come with us. We are laying an ambush for NSCN." So we went down into a valley next to a river. There was, stops, scouts,
Everything.
everything was there, and we were witnessing that. The whole night we spent, no success to the unit, but they gave me that experience of a lifetime.
Amazing, sir. This is so great to hear. You have very often interacted with who's who in the political circles also. Of course, the military circles. Any experience that you could share about your interactions with the Prime Minister or the Raksha Mantri or the present chief?
Well, Prime Minister, this current Prime Minister, I met once in a formal, appointment. But this was again a memorable day in the sense Kailash Range operations had just taken place, or at least the
Right.
story broke on that day,
That day.
31st of August 2020. And that day I was meeting him. So I found him to be very sharp in his focus, the ability to concentrate on something that is in front of you, that is me as a subject. So that's one experience with him. Among the Raksha Mantris, I happened to get a chance to become very close, like a friend, elder brother. Manohar Parrikar became like a friend and an elder brother in this 2.5 years that he was Raksha Mantri. He would come home. I have written about that also.
Correct.
His obituary, even I wrote from the heart. That is the first time I broke down in doing a program on camera. And second was when my other friend, General Bipin Rawat, passed away, died in that accident.
Right.
So again, that is on camera where I broke down because we had known each other from 1998 and had become friends over the years. I had a very early opportunity to meet Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee in 1985, January. Way back when they were down to two seats,
correct.
BJP, and I had asked him at the circuit house in Guwahati, and that I still have the clipping, where I had asked him that what now for BJP? Is it the end of BJP? So I'll never forget, as a youngster, I was barely 21 years old. He said, "राजनीति में आज हम यहाँ हैं, हम कल वहाँ होंगे." That line has never gone away from me. And he did that
He did.
within 15 years or 13 years.
He came to power.
1998, he became the Prime Minister. Another Prime Minister, but ex-Prime Minister I interacted with was Chandrasekhar. Rustic, perhaps one of the better Prime Ministers, I would say, who didn't get enough chance. Because he took many of those decisions.
complete
that
coalition.
Time. Yeah, complete coalition. Completely dependent. He had some 20 MPs
Right.
dependent on Congress and the others. But he imposed President's rule, ordered Operation Bajrang in Assam. Multiple things he did. I mean, if you go back to his tenure, you will realize many things he did. He was just somebody who was sharp, decisive, and rustic. And he could regale you with many of the inside stories. He did to many of us in that time, a young journalist in Guwahati in 1993 or 94. That kind of thing. So they're all human beings. They have their follies, but they're all passionate. They're all patriotic at the end of the day. Nobody is anti-national, as many people would like to say. I can never forget one person who gave me great insight into life and journalism was M.V. Kamath. If you come to my office, I have it inscribed in a frame on the wall, where he, again, early in my life, when I was not sure whether I should continue as a journalist or, give up and go somewhere else, he told me 3 mantras of journalism, which are actually applicable to any profession, also for life. And I'll quickly tell you what he said. He said, "Do serious work, never take yourself seriously." So I said, "Why? What does it mean?" He said, "No, as a journalist, if you continue, you will come across access to powerful people and you will start believing that you are also one of them."
Correct.
It's not true. So never take yourself seriously. Second, you're as good as your last byline. What you have done yesterday or today
Defines
is relevant, defines you. What you did 20 years ago, 25 years ago in Kargil doesn't matter. It's just a footnote in your journey. Again, didn't understand that time, but as I have grown older, I have understood the deep meaning that it had had. And the third thing he said, it is more important what you don't write than what you write. So again, I said, how can it be? So he said, no, many people will share secrets and their, inner decision-making processes and all
Privileged
that
information.
privileged information. Never give it out until they tell you that this is okay to give it out, because that will build your trust, their trust in you, and your trust in them, and friendships will grow like this, and which has stood me in absolute good stead. I couldn't have asked for, like I said, therefore I said no regrets in life. I couldn't have asked for a better thing, because I am not somebody who comes from a privileged background, who has done high flown degrees abroad in Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard, not had the backing, first generation journalist, but because I had these mentors all along the way, everywhere I came across these mentors, in the military, in journalism, in life. They have actually aided and abetted my journey, which has been eventful and not a moment of regret, as I said.
On that note, sir, I just have to ask you one question,
Sure.
and I take it from what you asked Vajpayee ji. You have done so much. Of course, his context was different. Your
Yeah.
context is different.
Correct.
What next? What is that is left to be done?
Well, I continue to do what I am doing. I'm building a team. I have built a team. I've got a YouTube channel. We are doing all that. I'm trying some hand in script writing
Wow.
in films, or at least being an advisor to the script writers on subjects that I know, like that. And that's just be somebody who can contribute to a discussion point going forward, because today's world, you live much longer. I have seen people who are in their mid 80s or beyond still working,
Still contributing.
still contributing, and I shouldn't rest on my laurels or whatever they are. I should continue to do what I'm doing, and maybe different things, some advising, some consulting, some writing, more books. Maybe there are books
In the
I know
pipeline?
in the pipeline, in my mind, but again, no time. There are multiple activities. Sometimes I feel I do too many multiple activities.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming all the way from Delhi and giving us your time. And I know it is really privileged time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing and bringing out so many aspects that I didn't think that I would share with anybody like this. So you're a great interviewer in that sense, and you are a newcomer to this profession in that sense, but you're doing extremely well. Thank you for this.
Thank you, sir. Your compliment means a lot.
Pleasure.
Really means a lot.
Pleasure.
And to our audience, I hope you enjoyed this. You got to hear of things which you wouldn't have heard before. I would encourage all of you to read all his books. Every book is, written in gold, and the kind of nuggets and events and personalities that you would get in those books, probably very different to find. And of course, the whole swath of, nature of books that has been written. At the end, it is just for me to thank you, sir, and thanks for doing this.
Extremely privileged and pleasure to interact with you.
I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to our channel, give your likes and also your comments. We take them very, very seriously. Thank you so much.